Okay, back to our regularly scheduled programming. Now that we've arrived at the end of the Castlevania retrospective, I wanted to take the time and look back on everything so far. For this being my first time playing the Castlevania series, it's been a complete pleasure getting to see the series beginning, the odd sequel, and the fantastic third entry, culminating in the one released on the SNES. I love the simplicity of Castlevania 1, alongside the improvements made in Castlevania 3. So once I arrived at Super Castlevania 4, I was excited to see how Castlevania 4 made the jump into the 16-bit. For many Castlevania fans, Super Castlevania 4 is regarded as the best classic Castlevania game and one of the best games in the series. Though I'll admit, that's a bold statement to make because once Castlevania transitioned to become a Metroidvania, the criteria for what could be considered the best Castlevania game became more skewed. That's why I made it a point to specify it under Classic Castlevania, because I know the discrepancies between this game and Symphony of the Night, for example. Super Castlevania 4 would be the first entry without series creator Hitoshi Akamatsu, which presented Konami with a unique challenge. Can they match the charm and vision Akamatsu brought with the original trilogy while evolving the formula to fit with improved technology? Just to spoil it now, the answer is a wholehearted yes. This game is fantastic, and I'm glad to see Castlevania successfully made the jump onto the SNES like Mario and Zelda did. As for where to properly begin, the best place to start in my opinion is to go over the story. Super Castlevania 4 is not a new story starring another Belmont, instead it's a pseudo-retelling of the original Castlevania. Once again, or for the first time technically, we play as Simon Belmont, as he makes his way to Castlevania to battle Dracula. It says that every 100 years, the forces of good weaken. Count Dracula will arrive from his slumber, ready to wage war against humanity. However, the Belmont clan stands at the vanguard ready to battle Dracula whenever he returns. In the 100 years since their last encounter, on a dark night, Dracula is revived and his castle returns overlooking the peaceful countryside of Transylvania. Simon Belmont readies the vampire killer, ready to begin his adventure. According to the developers, this game is meant to be a reboot of the original Castlevania, explaining why once again we're playing as Simon, whereas other fans like to insert it into the timeline, having it being set in the events after Simon's quest. Which is a theory I do see the merits in, because the opening narration begins at a cemetery, which you'll remember in the ending of Simon's quest, has Simon bury Dracula. Or it could just be Super Castlevania 4 set in an alternate reality. But I really like the idea that because Simon is widely regarded as the most recognizable Belmont, his story has been retold over the years, causing many of the details to be lost or changed over the years. That statement comes more from my perspective, but it does help at the very least validate every version of Castlevania 1. Again, it's the same story retold with different details, because if every story was canon, that would mean Simon's fought Dracula at least 5 times. I mean, regardless, I'm glad to be playing as Simon again. Like I said in Castlevania 3, Simon's my favorite Belmont, and they've made some major improvements in his sprite. For one thing, Simon has gotten massive, really hitting leg day especially. Without a doubt, this design screams Conan the Barbarian more than ever. That doesn't apply only to Simon. In fact, the entire game looks incredible. The opening title screen is the best opening from classic Castlevania. The pan-up with the ominous music revealing the title screen surrounded by spiders and webs, and when pressing the start button a wolf's howl is heard. Super Castlevania 4 definitely leans more onto its horror themes rather than classic cinema like previously. All of the levels have a darker art style. Of course, that's thanks to the 16-bit graphics, but besides that, Super Castlevania 4 doesn't heavily borrow from the previous games when it comes to its levels. There's a lot more variety, like a cursed treasure room or a haunted library, but it all blends so well thanks to the attention to detail that goes above and beyond what was expected at the time, like having enemies be covered in gold, or a waterfall effect in level 3. Now, because we're on the SNES, Super Castlevania 4 also takes advantage of the new technology. Case in point being the inclusion of Mode 7 graphics in Level 4 especially. But rather than being a gimmick taken on for the sake of it, it enhances the level, making Level 4 one of the more standout stages. Plus, there's that great section before where you have to use your whip to dangle onto a hook while the room rotates. Stuff like this is great because it demonstrates how well crafted every level is. So far, the levels in Super Castlevania 4 are my favorite levels in classic Castlevania. The design of the world is so well thought out that every level complements one another because of how connected they all are. The ending of Stage 2 has you descend into a cave system, serving as the setup for Stage 3, which has you use the caves and then ascend up a waterfall to the ancient ruins, with the cherry on top being the map once again chronicling your journey. There are still classic Castlevania enemies like the Medusa heads and armored knights, but they are more sporadically placed across the game with a lot of new enemies to take their place, allowing each level to have a distinct identity. The enemies in this game are fantastic. It still holds true to classic Castlevania, however enemies will change their designs and patterns based on the level they're in. One level might have enemies reach above a headstone to grab Simon, while another will use a painting instead. Believe it or not, my favorite enemy in this game is the dancing couple found in the ballroom in Castlevania, because not only is it creepy a ghost couple is trying to attack you, but even the tables come alive, hinting at the boss you'll face at the end. With one or two exceptions, the bosses in Super Castlevania 4 are all unique, avoiding the trap in Castlevania 3 had, where the game reused many of the same bosses with the only difference being added phases. Though I do think the bosses have become easier because most of them can be bum rushed by constantly spamming your whip, so take that as you will. However, the cherry on top has to be the soundtrack for this game. Masanori Adachi and Taro Kudo served as the composers, and they did a fantastic job with not only the soundtrack but the sound effects as well. According to Super Castlevania 4's director Masahiro Ueno, he wanted the soundtrack to interact with the environment. Super Castlevania 4's version of Vampire Killer is my favorite version of the song, and the rest of the soundtrack is no joke, having a lot of head-bopping songs paired with a good bass line. The whoosh sound the Vampire Killer makes when used has that impact needed to let you know the power it carries, because Super Castlevania 4 makes you feel like a badass vampire hunter, and the satisfaction you get when you defeat an enemy and watch them explode is chef's kiss. Thankfully, Simon was also given his fair share of improvements. Simon no longer handles the same way like he did in Castlevania 1. Now he can actually control his mid-air momentum, which comes with all the improvements you expect, making platforming less about timing, but giving you more leniency if you miss your jump. That being said, in terms of overall platforming, the challenge the game gives you is fantastic. The knockback is still there, but it's more forgiving this time around, with the level design having less bottomless pits as before. On top of that, Simon feels less heavier than he did previously, adding to the already superior platforming. I didn't mention this in Castlevania 3, but there were these platforms that if you landed on top would flip over, causing you to fall into a bottomless pit. And while they do make a return, thanks to Simon's new physics, he can quickly land on one, then instantly jump again without causing the platform to flip over. While not controlling your jump was a landmark of classic Castlevania, I think by the time we got to the SNES, it was a matter of time and quality assurance that this change would take place. And honestly, I'm pretty sure everyone who played the originals easily welcomed this change. However, that wasn't the only major overhaul. No longer are stairs as dangerous as they previously were. Now you can jump on them and freely jump off at your own discretion, giving more control to the player, which I think is Super Castlevania 4's greatest achievement. You can use his controls to skip past this section of the library, avoiding those annoying lamp enemies that follow you. I personally view Super Castlevania 4's controls the same way I do Super Mario World, where both games should be viewed as the gold standard for how a platformer should control. New to Super Castlevania 4, Simon can use his whip to latch on the hooks and swing around like Indiana Jones. You use the sticks to build momentum, and sometimes it's used to find alternate paths and hidden secrets. And while it is cool for the first couple of times, it feels a little finicky when you have to do it back to back, like when you have to scale the tower in level B while trying to outrun the buzzsaw. Still, it's cool that the developers found ways to get more out of the whip, so I commend them for that. However, the greatest change made to the Vampire Killer is that now you can whip it in 8 directions. As a result, combat is no longer about timing and proper positioning, but now about adapting a more run-and-gun strategy. This in turn makes Simon a total badass in this game. He no longer has to wait for the enemy to be in his line of sight, and can instead whip an enemy diagonally above him with ease, meaning no matter what the game throws at you, you're always ready and can proceed at your own pace. I should at least mention that ever since Castlevania 1, the multi-directional whip was intended to be implemented, but it wasn't due to the obvious technical limitations, so you could see where the SNES fit into that equation. But it doesn't stop there, because by holding down the attack button, the whip will become flaccid, allowing you to swing it around all over the place.
That's what she said!
The trade-off, however, is the whip will do less damage, but will stun the enemy when briefly hit. It's great to use when you're being swarmed by enemies and need to think quickly, and while standing still, because even just by running into it, enemies will take damage. Now, before beginning my playthroughs, I like to go into the settings and change the controls to fit my standards. In my previous Castlevania videos, thanks to the Anniversary Collection, I'm able to pause the game and do exactly that. However, in the case of Super Castlevania 4, I had to remap the buttons within the game itself. That's fine on the surface, but I had to mess around with the controls to find the combination I like. For context, when I record games on my PC, I use a plug-in Switch controller, and when I got to Super Castlevania 4, and took a look inside the in-game manual, it displayed an Xbox controller, and haphazardly placed the PC controls in another box. Eventually, I managed to find out the controls, which are Y to whip and A to jump, or A to jump and B to whip on my controller. Not a fault of Super Castlevania 4, but the Anniversary Collection. However, it's still worth mentioning if you're going to play this version of the game. Just to make this quick, I'll also go over the sub-weapons. Like before, all the previous ones return, and to be honest, the only one you should realistically be using is the boomerang, because once you upgrade it to level 3, like the holy water, it shreds everything in its path, which, speaking of, had a complete fall from grace in this game. Upgrading your sub-weapons is no longer related to a lucky drop or finding it, but about defeating 10 enemies to guarantee a drop. In fact, candles also count towards your total, as long as you use the sub-weapon to destroy them. A good change that makes getting upgrades more consistent. To get back to what I said about the boomerang destroying everything, that lets me segue into talking about the bosses in this game. Like I said, bosses can be completely melted with the whip, but realistically, the boomerang is the weapon you should always have when fighting bosses. However, from a gameplay and variety perspective, there's a lot of quality and quantity when it comes to the bosses. Some stages will have mini-bosses, and in terms of their challenge, all of them require you to memorize their patterns and know when to attack. So when you're fighting Medusa, as long as you stay crouched, you'll avoid her petrifying gaze, and for Death, attack when he's vulnerable while throwing his scythe. Some bosses are easier than others. Though the golem in stage 4 may be large, the platforms are a ruse because his whole body is vulnerable, and the more damage you deal, the smaller he gets. Then in stage B, the game throws 3 back-to-back bosses at you, making it a gauntlet on a first playthrough. Still, I'm glad every stage has their own boss, because it got very redundant when Castlevania 3 kept reusing the same ones. When you compare the difficulty of Super Castlevania 4 to its predecessors, it's definitely the easiest out of the 4. And while classic Castlevania was known for its difficulty, Super Castlevania 4 is, in my opinion, the perfection of the Castlevania formula, due to all the improvements made in this game. Your first playthrough will always be your hardest, however, like I said in Castlevania 1, the more playthroughs you do, the better you'll get. And to be honest, I never thought classic Castlevania was very hard. That is to say, unfairly hard. When beginning the game, I think the first couple of stages are a great introduction. There's still the great walk up to the entrance, and once you pass through the next 3 stages, they ease you into learning the new mechanics, like in stage 1 when you have to use the whip to swing across a bottomless pit. It isn't until the last half of stage 3 when the game starts using vertical level design to incentivize platforming, and I remember during my first playthrough, I was tripped out over the foreground because I wasn't sure if I could walk over them, but once I figured it out, I thought it was a cool attention to detail. But nothing comes close to stage 4, which easily is my favorite level in the game. The first part doesn't stand out, but the second and third part is great, with the rotating room and having to outrun the falling floor. Stage 5 is very short, only consisting of 2 parts, but does contain the steps into Castlevania proper. Once you enter Dracula's castle, here's where the difficulty spikes. Levels get much longer, and the quantity of enemies over dangerous set pieces ramps up. Stage 6 is the entrance hall in previous games, except in the section when you have to platform on top of the chandeliers, ending with the boss fight against the ghost couple. Stage 6 is also where the armored knights make their reappearance, so be on the lookout for their throwing axes. The next stage, Stage 7, aka the library, has more aggressive enemy placement, like when scaling down the long corridor, where the annoying lamp enemies like to swarm you. What I'm talking about specifically is when you have to jump atop these floating books, while red skeletons wait for you at the end. And if you've played previous Castlevania games, you know that they'll resurrect after a while. Which isn't fun when you're standing over a bottomless pit, and I won't lie, I got reckless and didn't time my jumps correctly. Then the next stage, Stage 8, I'd say is the hardest because of the toxic water and insta-kill spikes. But thanks to Simon's crouch, which I realized I didn't mention up until now, can let Simon duck walk to avoid getting hit. At the very least, the boss against Frankenstein is pretty easy. Stage 9 is the final stage before the alphabet levels, and the overall level and boss are pretty easy, but goes down as having my favorite level aesthetic. However, the last 2 stages are the game throwing its most difficult challenges at you. Stage A, the clock tower, has you obviously ascend the clock tower, but one thing I forgot to mention is once you go up, you can't backtrack, pretty much crossing a point of no return. At the top you'll battle the mummy, and as a boss, depending on its RNG, can be taken out quickly or give you a hard time, since you fight it on uneven ground. As far as final stages go, Stage B is the hardest stage in the game. In the beginning it throws 2 chase sequences at you, and the latter one where you have to ascend a tower being chased by the buzzsaw, and at the end overcome the most difficult platforming section in the game. But if you think that's bad, the game throws 3 back-to-back bosses at you. You have to be on your toes during this stage because getting a game over and having to start this stage again is not in your best interest, I'd say. The first boss is the most annoying because throughout the fight, he'll temporarily be invincible until he isn't. In his first phase, as long as you go back and forth and duck under his spear, you'll move on to his second phase. This is where he becomes more difficult and you have to dodge his beak attack while running back and forth. Expect to take damage at least once because he's quick when he uses that beak attack. After that, the games are nice enough to give you some free health, and the next boss is the easiest of the two, and you can quickly defeat him by staying in the corner and using the boomerang. Finally, there's Death, who can quickly be beaten as well with the same strategy, opening the way to Dracula's tower. Rising the towers, Simon enters Dracula's throne room, beginning the final boss. Dracula has 3 phases, however, he won't be transforming into a demon this time around. In his first phase, he'll teleport around launching projectiles at you that split into smaller pellets when hit, or when you jump. A recommended tactic is to use the boomerang on Dracula's head and use the Flaccid Whip to destroy his projectiles, which you can clearly tell I didn't use at all during this fight. But if you take damage, sometimes Dracula will shoot these balls that do a spread attack, and if you destroy them, they'll drop a chicken leg. In his second phase, Dracula will start using fire pillars like in Castlevania 3, except it'll leave behind 2 fire spirits who will chase you. But by destroying them, Dracula won't summon more pillars, pretty much leaving him easily vulnerable. However, once his health is low, Dracula engulfs the room in lightning and enters his final phase. Here, he'll rain down lightning and you'll have to avoid them while attacking Dracula. As long as you stay close to Dracula and move out of the way of his attacks at the last moment, Dracula will be defeated, dramatically bursting into flames, with Simon afterwards viewing the destruction of Castlevania. And with that marks the finale of the Castlevania retrospective. Let me say, it's been an honor getting to experience the early Castlevania games, witnessing how each entry built one of the best platformers in video game history. Though Castlevania may still be on hiatus, the reason I decided to cover Castlevania was because, for one, I knew the status the series carried, and second, videos like these keep Castlevania in the public consciousness. If not, these videos have convinced me to check out the rest of the series, and given Castlevania has a huge library of games, I have my work cut out for me. As for Super Castlevania 4 itself, the best compliment I can give this game is that it's the really good one on the SNES. It took everything that made 1 and 3 great, and made it even better. Though funnily enough, I don't think this is the best place to start if you want to play Castlevania, because in my opinion, you start with 1 and work your way up to 4. Yes, even Simon's Quest is worth playing. And to throw a bone to its fans, without it, Symphony of the Night wouldn't have had a foundation to build upon, and that same analogy also applies to Super Castlevania 4. And I'll leave it on that note. With that being said, I'll leave you guys like I always do. Thank you for watching, and take care.